Welcome to the Next Gen CMO podcast, where we sit down with seasoned CMOs and emerging talents in sales and marketing to explore the wins and occasional losses that shape today's leaders and the strategic maneuvers that can help propel you to the forefront of B2B marketing.
Welcome to the Next Gen CMO podcast. I'm your host. My name is Kelly Hopping, and I'm the CMO at Demandbase. Today, we're excited to welcome Amanda Malko to the podcast. Amanda is a go-to-market leader with 20 years of experience scaling high-growth tech companies from 50 million to $1 billion, as well as advising some of the world's best consumer brands. Throughout her career, she has driven significant revenue growth and billions in shareholder value for software and marketing services companies such as G2 and MailChimp. We're so excited to have her today. Welcome to the podcast, Amanda.
Thanks for having me, Kelly. It's great.
Yeah.
Great to see you on the podcast.
Thank you. It's always fun to bring past relationships into the forefront of our modern days.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. Okay. So let's learn a little bit about you. You are a 3-time CMO. Congrats on everything you've accomplished in your past lives. Very impressive backgrounds. I'd love to kick off today with just sharing a quick history of your background, both as a CMO and as an advisor.
Yeah. So I'm, like you said, I've been a 3-time CMO, but actually started my career in sales. And I think that, and started in sales from an early age, actually. And my father was in sales and his father was in sales. So always thought I would do sales and then sort of stumbled into marketing. And so I think everything that I've done since has really been kind of at the service of the customer, because that's what you're taught. If you learn from the best in sales, you're taught to be in service of the customer. And so it's really framed the way that I think about marketing and the relationship with sales as well. And so, yeah, I've been fortunate to work at some great companies like G2, MailChimp. I've done everything from PLG to enterprise, and I kind of love them all equally. It's hard to pick, but yeah, I've really enjoyed it. And I love talking to marketers of all kinds. So enjoy doing these podcasts, but also learning. I learn a lot. I do a lot of reverse mentorship and learn a lot from up and coming marketers as well.
Very cool. Very cool. So I read recently that the average tenure of a CMO has dropped. They say it's now around 3 years. I think that's probably generous. I think it's probably a little bit lower than that in reality when you factor in smaller companies, startups, founders, especially in a recession like we're in. And with up and coming leaders, marketing leaders being the majority listener to this podcast, you think about senior directors or VPs who are aspiring CMOs, that stat can be kind of jarring. But you mentioned that a lot of churn is because sometimes neither party, the brand or the CMO, is really set up for success. Can you share some of your thoughts here?
Yeah. And I would love to know your thoughts on this too. I think it's a really discussed topic. And actually, I feel like someone came out with a study recently that tenure is going up. Some still think it's going down. I, like you, feel like 3 years might be a little generous for B2B SaaS companies in particular. It's something that I would say in the last year, I've heard from more CEOs for advice on how to hire a CMO than any point ever in my career. And so I think it's difficult on both sides, actually. And I attribute it to really 2 core things. One is misalignment on the scope of the job with the impact that you want the CMO to have. And so I'll give you an example. One CEO called me and he said, Amanda, I've tried to hire a CMO twice now. I have really struggled. Can you just give me some advice on what should I do differently? And so we started asking some questions about what happened? And he was super thoughtful and super well-intentioned, but he wanted the ultimate metric of the CMO to be on SQL, so sales qualified leads. And as we started digging into that, which is a fine metric, by the way, and it's an important metric, all of the technology, the people, the processes of what constitutes an SQL and how you set it up. I mean, most marketers are probably nodding their heads yes, obviously, but are owned and accountable. They're owned and accountable to the sales team. And so what he really wanted was a CMO who was in support of the sales metric, which is fine, but it's a C-level role. You want to have a metric that the CMO can uniquely impact that is hopefully equally important to the metrics that sales has as well. And so ultimately, we're all trying to get to revenue. And so in this case, I think a lot of the things that were challenging for that particular role was that the right metric for the CMO to be measured on? And it doesn't mean it was the right person for the job, but how do we make sure that the scope that the CMO has aligns with the impact that you want them to have. And if it's a measure that they can't uniquely control or impact, it's probably not the right one. And if it's not a measure that's super important to your business, it's probably not time for CMO, or you need to think about the CMO more broadly. So I think that alignment of what's the scope of the role and does it align with the impact you want it to have is probably where I see the biggest disconnect. And you can see it pretty clearly in the way job descriptions are written. A lot of times for the CRO, it's all about revenue, and for the CMO, it's all about tactics. And then ultimately, you start to see some of that alignment issue come to the forefront in even just the job spec. I think the second thing is hiring a great CMO for the wrong type of company. And frankly, as candidates, this is also really hard if you're a CMO looking for a role. How do you find a role that aligns with what you do really well? And so Harvard Business Review has an amazing article. It's several years old now, but it's still sort of my gold standard for how to think about CMO roles. And they basically said there's sort of 3 archetypes. There's a kind of promotion or commercial only role where the CMO is really focused on promoting the brand and the company. There's a role that's focused on really strategy and owning go-to-market strategy. And then they have sort of a P&L wide role, which tends to be more common in B2C companies. And I think even in B2B, you often find these really strategic, senior, seasoned CMOs who are, owning go-to-market strategy, ending up in promotion-only roles where they feel like they're underutilized and maybe they don't feel as challenged in the job. And then the flip side can happen too. And so I think just finding the type of role for the type of CMO you are, and also at the size and stage company where you feel like you work best is super important. So that's my long answer to like the 2 kind of core things I see come up a lot. And it's hard on both sides.
Yeah, there's so many points in there that I want to dig into a little bit. So I love what you said about hiring the right CMO for the right company. I know from my experience, I'm now on, I don't know what I am, CMO 4, maybe 3, something like that. And I have done sort of like big established company. I have done tiny Series A startup. I've done kind of like late stage, still private, kind of mid-size, and realized, and I think I'm a pretty decent CMO, but I realized in the Series A, like I'm not a startup CMO. And I know that. And I'm not, I'm just not wired that way. And so I also think about the stage of company as being the match, as you talked about, between like what you're looking for. And I think those founders tend to want a big, bold, grandiose, experienced CMO because often founders have maybe a little tiny bit of ego that goes with it. So they want to have this kind of great CMO to put on a pedestal, but they also want someone who's like hungry and junior and scrappy and in the weeds and all the things. And so oftentimes that seems to be a different CMO than what they think they want.
Yeah. That's very well said. And you've had enough experience. I mean, you're very experienced. You've had enough experience across a range and size of stages. You know what you do really well. But CMOs, so if you're listening and you're not a CMO yet, but you want to get there, like thinking about size and stage fit is so important. And we don't know what we don't know, right? And so a lot of times I speak with CMOs who are like, I thought I could do Series A. And so I tried it and I realized all these things that frankly, I think that that's like the hardest stage, like proceed in Series A, like those jobs are infinitely harder in my opinion, because so much is still being formed and shaped, including in the product, and super fun, but very, very different from like a Series D or public company. And so we don't know what we don't know. So my advice is always just like, if you've never done it before, at least like speak with as many people who have as possible and know that the job of a CMO, the scope can be very different. And a lot of times it can be very different depending on where the company is in their growth trajectory. And so if you don't know, ask and learn from other CMOs. The hardest way to learn is on the job and realizing it's not the right fit. So
yeah, I agree. The other thing you said, I think there's a few elements of the role and scope and comparing that with the organization that gets to go with it. So for example, you talked about a marketing leader who's held responsible through SQLs. SQLs are created by SDRs typically, or BDRs. Those sort of sit on the fence between marketing and sales. I've had them under me. I've had them under the sales leader. And it's hard sometimes. And it sounds like a cop out, but really like when a team is outside of your organization, sometimes it's hard to influence, but then you're responsible for what they deliver. And that's a challenge too, right? When your org design doesn't match your KPIs.
100%. And it happens all the time. And I think it's well-intentioned oftentimes because we're all working towards the same goal. And so this idea that it shouldn't really matter. I understand it in philosophically, but it creates what I think is unnecessary friction or tension within, for the CEO and within your leadership teams, where if you really think about org design and org strategy, and then how all of the metrics align across all of your leaders, it actually, I've seen organizations who do it well and organizations who struggled with it. And it's an amazing, what a difference, just having the right org design for your size, stage, and company with the right measures of accountability for all your leaders. I mean, it's fairly game changing for organizations who get that right.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. I agree. And it's one of the things that we, me and my chief revenue officer partner work daily on. Like, how do we make sure our metrics are in lockstep? How do we share all the same metrics? You win, I win, you lose, we lose. We're going to do this together because of some of those challenges. Okay, so while we're talking about org design or the org structures in general, the market's tough right now. There's a lot of layoffs. There's a lot of changes in team structures, and I think that probably contributes to some of the, reduced tenure of CMOs as well. It's sort of marketing is one of those sort of first places to blame. If we're missing our revenue targets, you're like, it's probably marketing not bringing enough pipeline in. So let's do a change of thought there, new leadership, new creativity, new something. But as you think about this type of a market environment, how do you advise CMOs to approach org design?
Well, it's a great question. And yeah, it's probably one of the biggest. I think it's worth noting that in our prior question about CMO tenure being so short, anytime and you and I have experienced multiple economic downturns, like anytime that happens, marketing is usually the first place people look. It's hard to know what's the environment, what's within our control. I think that it can be very easy to say, well, let's just turn over the CMO and see if that helps. And so I do think that that's probably one of the most prevalent reasons we're seeing turnover now. In terms of org design, I was actually I think this applies to CEOs too. I was talking to a CEO recently about this. I would start with a blank page. We were talking about he has a very unique business. It has a lot of complex go-to-market dynamics. And he was trying to think through, does he need a CMO? Is it a CR? Like, how should he think about it? And I said, well, why not just go back to he was sort of designing around his current organization is what was happening. And I said, that's totally reasonable. You have certain people in seat, but I usually advise, and what I try and do is start with a blank sheet of paper and say, what would the ideal structure look like? And there's lots of things to consider there. There's what do we need? What are the kind of key goals and outputs we need the business to drive? I always think about skill sets required for each role. And a lot of times, in the thing in org design, it's very tempting to put an apple and an orange together because it seems like they should fit intellectually, but then you think about the skills required and it's you're looking for a unicorn. So try and avoid unicorns because they really don't exist. And so thinking about what do I need? What are the skill in terms of outputs? What are the skills required? And what's a reasonable number of direct reports? In this case, the CEO also had over 10 direct reports, which wasn't reasonable. So we were clean sheet of paper, you probably wouldn't choose 10, right? And I think the clean sheet of paper exercise can be really game changing because it doesn't mean that that's where you're going tomorrow, but at least it gives you a view of what would be ideal for the organization, which is really what org design should support. It should support the needs of the organization, not the needs of the people sitting in the seats today. And then you can think about what's the right way to get there. And that might be a plan over time based around what's realistic from a hiring and talent perspective.
Yeah, I love that. It's so easy to try to build an org around the people that you have instead of the strategy that you need. We talk a lot about, we love our people, but we have to put company first and then people. And so that company requires, what is the strategy? What are the core objectives? What does success look like? Sometimes the people fit, sometimes they don't. Sometimes it's even, I need that skill set. That's too senior. I don't need that senior of that function. Other times it's, man, we are not focusing on content enough. I need to elevate my content role or whatever it happens to be. So I love that perspective.
Yeah. And sometimes you can actually find roles you didn't know you needed, and that becomes a growth opportunity for somebody else. And so it can equally be beneficial for the people who are in seat today, because I really think every organization, especially if it's a fast growing organization, they should be doing it every 12 to 18 months. And I think a lot of times it's a daunting thing to think about reorganizing that much. And so we tend to design around the people because that's a little easier to think about change management within the current scope. But if you do sort of the fresh sheet of paper every 12 to 18 months, it can actually unlock a lot of opportunities, certainly for the organization, but also growth opportunities for people. Whereas if you don't sit down and think about what are the unmet needs, sometimes those growth opportunities may not emerge as easily.
Yeah, it's one of the exercises I just went through when I got here in I started in September. In November, I rolled out a new org, and I didn't, I was starting from scratch because I was brand new. And so it was a total blank sheet of paper exercise. And it required, kind of I met every single person in marketing one-on-one, tried to understand their skill sets, their interests, their career aspirations, all those things, and then tried to build around it. And even with that and trying to adhere to both the strategy and how the people would plug into that structure, change management was a big part of the deal, right? So you talk about like doing every, 12 to 18 months, totally agree. The change management is a part that is like learning, okay, what's new in my role? I need to get to know my new boss, need to understand my new KPIs, but it's so worth it because to your point, it brings out such a different skill set almost, or a different capability, or a different check in their toolbox where people have kind of typecast themselves, and then all of a sudden they get a chance to do something different and stretch. And it's great development for them.
Yeah, absolutely. But change management is hard. I could ask you all kinds of questions about how you handle change management, but I mean, I think it's a natural sort of byproduct of change, and change usually comes, not always, but often, from growth for the business and for the people. But it doesn't make it easy. It's definitely one of the harder parts of the job.
Yeah, I've had to learn that because I love change. I get bored easily. And so I'm like, oh, let's do something different. Let's try something different, try a new role, reinvent. But not everybody feels that. And so that's what I have to remind myself, is that not everybody loves what we are doing here. So I need to, bring them along for the ride.
Yes. And I think I had a mentor once who reminded me of that, because I'm like you. I really love change. And he said the first thing anyone thinks whenever you tell them any change, no matter what it is, but especially if it's about their role, is what's in it for me. And so usually there's something that's going to be beneficial for them, or you can find, even if it's longer term, what this path could be for them. And I'm a big believer that, like, when you can find what's in it for them, it's a win-win for all sides. And usually that's true. But yeah, change management, it's still hard, but sometimes if you can kind of personalize the message to what's in it for the individual, it helps. For me, change is enough. I just enjoy it, but that's not true for everyone.
Yeah, that's great advice. I like that. The what's in it for me, that's a great way to think about it. And hopefully the way that we can frame those changes back to the people on our teams. Very cool. All right, we're going to shift some gears here. So you were at G2. I'm a big fan of G2. For background for folks who are listening, is that's how Amanda and I met. I was the CMO over Gartner Digital Markets, which is made of Capterra, Software Advice, and GetApp. Capterra is probably the closest competitor to a G2. So somehow our paths crossed. We got a chance to chat during that time. We were both managing similar reviews type voice of the customer businesses. So given your role at G2 and that firsthand experience in how valuable the voice of the customer is in go-to-market, as well as in customer success, how do you think this has changed over the past couple of years?
Yeah, I feel like, well, there's a lot to unpack there. There's how has the voice of customer changed? And then sort of like the role of the voice of the customer in the organization. I think on the second piece, anytime there's a downturn, there's a lot of changing in needs and expectations from your customer. And so it's easy to get into sort of, I think, because I've experienced this myself, like fight or flight mode, where it's just, well, let's try all these different things and see what sticks. And it's actually the time to double down and focus on how is our customer changing? If we can know that faster and better than anybody else, we can be smart and surgical about the types of products we develop, the types of changes we make, the strategy of who we go after and why. And so I actually think that in an environment where you have a downturn and there's this, most people run towards, let's do as many things as possible and see what sticks. The people who slow down and realize, because of this, my customers' needs and expectations are changing, and understand how, and are really, really focused on how they adapt around that, I think are the ones that win. So I'd say voice of the customer has never been more important. And the companies that are doing really well, I am fortunate. I get to see and speak with a lot of companies. I Without a doubt, I was very convinced on the importance of voice of the customer before, but I am like more fanatical about it than ever, because when I go under the hood of, well, how are you learning so that your strategy aligns with what your customer needs? There's always a very clear answer. The companies that do really well and are still growing right now, they have a very clear answer to that question. And the ones who are like, well, we do a little here and a little there and nobody really owns it, or we don't really have a clear way of bringing it back into the product, I think those companies tend to struggle a little bit more. And then, yeah, I think voice of the customer and how you capture it and harness it is such a core job of marketing. Even if it's not in the scope, I just don't see how we do our jobs, without it. Even if the CEO is not thinking that way, I think we have to do our jobs.
Yeah, and I think it can be both customer, as we think about sort of voice of the market, but also voice of our actual customers, as I think about in this down market recession. I'm a big believer that the return on customer marketing investment far exceeds acquisition, because people just don't take bets on new vendors all that much in a down economy. They're going to they may expand with the partner, the customer that they trust, or the vendor that they trust. And so that shift and kind of it all being about external acquisition to actually like, hey, customer marketing is actually really, really important. And we have a captive audience. There's sort of a free market to get in front of, and they already love us and trust us. How do we build on that?
Yeah, spot on. I mean, that was a big shift businesses made last year, and I think most very quickly. But if you didn't have a great repeatable expansion motion, wow, a lot of people had to learn on the fly last year. I saw a lot of pricing models change, and like, oh, we need more upside in our core pricing and packaging. So, but I think you're 100% right. Like, customer marketing is so important, and it's going to pay dividends in the long run, because even on the acquisition side, when that comes back, and I think it's starting to, this because of your past experience, like all the research says, and we should know this because intuitively as humans, it's how we think. We are more likely to trust the opinion of a peer or someone that we know and respect than any sales and marketing that comes from the company. And so how can we make sure that your customer's voice is the thing that is at the forefront of your message, and use them in your marketing, because they're probably word of mouth and referrals is probably your number one channel, and you just can't measure it. So, or can't measure it as well as you want to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's why we're doubling down this year on partner marketing. It's a fairly new motion for our company, because it just hasn't been done in the past. It's been fairly direct, but that same insight, right, that people trust when someone they trust refers or recommends, then they're going to go there, right? When my electrician recommends a plumber, I'm just like, yes, please. I don't need to call anybody else. I'm just calling that plumber. And that's amazing power of influence.
Yes, for sure. And especially for your business, you're so interconnected into how people need to go to market, that those partners are, that's a great mark of approval for Demandbase if a partner is referring you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, cool. Let's shift back to you a little bit as we start to wind down here. So you've been a 3-time CMO and are now in an advisor capacity. Tell me a little bit about that shift. What drove that shift, and what you're focusing on now in your sort of advising and coaching capacity?
Well, and it's interesting. I never told you this, but I thought back to our first conversation when I first met you, Kelly, as I was sort of making some decisions last year. And so I have to thank you for that, because I took away a lot from that first conversation we had. So I stepped into an advisor role at G2 in February of last year, in part and in large part to focus on my son. He was having some health challenges, and he's better now, and I'm so grateful. But it was more than I could do while also doing the job well, essentially. But I'm really lucky because I got to stay connected with G2 as an advisor. I help run our customer advisory board. So back to the voice of the customer. And it's really been, a blessing to be able to prioritize my family first and take the time I needed, but also kind of keep a toe in. And I've learned so much this year, or this past year, just from seeing different companies and talking to different CEOs and CMOs about their challenges. You see a lot of the shared struggles, and then also some like unique patterns, like voice of the customer. Like I'm now a fanatic. I was on the bandwagon before, but now I've really seen what a superpower it is for companies who have it. So yeah, that's what I spent the last year really advising CEOs and CMOs and learning a lot myself.
Oh, I love that. Well, one, I love that you put family first. I think that's super valuable. And that's a big thing for me too. I have 3 kids and they are super active, and I'm big on protecting my non-negotiables when I communicate with my leaders on this is what I need. I don't miss my kids' game, not even for a board meeting. Like, these are things that I want to make sure that are understood. So I love that you did that. And I love that, I think from each of my work experiences, I'm starting to build my little toolkit of, like you said, those nuances that are different, the shared similarities, but also the differences. And so as an advisor talking to lots of companies, I'm sure, whether you stay in advisor capacity forever or whether you shift back into an operating role at some point, you'll come back much more informed with where you want to be, where you don't want to be, where the opportunities are, where the blind spots are, which will be great for you.
Yeah, it's really helpful. And I think my takeaway from the time for people who are, I want to be a CMO, maybe you are, maybe you're headed there, is don't wait, or don't, hopefully you never have the sort of personal challenges, but don't wait for a time to be an advisor. Like, I think, it's easy. These are big jobs. We have a lot of time spent at work, but a non-negotiable for me in career-wise is I will always spend time in mentorship and both reverse mentorship and like from my mentors. And I try and make it a weekly habit because I certainly fell out of that in CMO roles because I learned so much from it. And I think it's easy to just not see the market, the big picture market perspective when we're so focused on the sort of week to week in the CMO roles. And so I don't know, I would just say, figure out how to kind of work that way into your day-to-day or week-to-week routine, because you won't regret it. You'll learn so much from the conversations.
Yeah, for sure. That's great advice. Thank you. And it's one of the reasons why we started this podcast, because I wanted to spend time with peers who are going through the same things that I have or will in the future, or have before me if I haven't yet. So I appreciate this peer mentorship right here in our conversation.
Likewise. And listen to this podcast. That would be a good use of the time every week. So.
Awesome. Okay, one more question. What is just one fun fact about you that most people maybe don't know?
Okay. I'm so tempted to ask you this, but if you haven't answered, you should on whatever. Because I would love to know yours. So mine is, I already said one, which is I started in sales. So I can't pick that one. I'm related to 2 of the 3 people who broke out about Alcatraz.
Wow. How far removed? I
don't know what that says about me, but
I see it. You're a fighter. I like it.
So I don't know what the exact, I think they were like my uncle's cousins, I think, but they are, so the last name is Anglin and my mother's last maiden name is Anglin, and they are from Georgia and I am from Georgia. And I did not know this until a couple years ago. And so my aunt had gone through and done our whole family tree, but apparently everyone already knew this and they just didn't tell me. And so a couple years ago, my mom casually, there's movies about them and books. And so my mom casually was like, oh, the Anglin brothers, your relatives. And I was like, excuse me. And so, I don't know how far removed. Not that far.
I love that. That's amazing.
Obviously I did not know them, but they did grow up near my Anglin relatives here in Georgia. And I think we're related to my uncle.
Wow. So, very cool. That is an awesome fun fact. I love that. So thank you for sharing. And we will all look up the Anglin brothers at this point to figure out their story with the Alcatraz escape.
Cool. And now people may look at me sideways. I don't know about you.
No, I think they're going to want to hire you because you're scrappy and feisty, and they're going to be like, "Ooh, she comes from a long line of fighters."
And I don't know if they survived. That is like the bit. You'll Google it, and people will be like, "Are they still alive?"
Oh, you don't know?
I don't know. We never heard from them, as far as I know. That secret has not come up.
I love it. Well, very cool. And if people want to learn more about you, where should they go to find you?
Great question. LinkedIn is a great place, and you can message me there. And I think I have my messaging open, so feel free to reach out.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Amanda. This has been great. Thank you to our listeners for joining us, and we will see you on the next episode of the Next Gen CMO podcast.